You told a lie today. You probably told several, not dramatic ones, not the kind that appear in crime dramas or moral philosophy, small ones. The meeting was fine. Traffic was terrible. I already ate. I'm almost there. The kind of social lubricant that fills the gaps between what is actually happening and what is comfortable to say about it. Now imagine that capacity disappears. Not as a moral choice, not as a resolution that requires ongoing effort, but as a biological fact. The neural pathway that allows the construction of a statement you know to be false simply stops functioning. In every human being on Earth, simultaneously, overnight, you can still choose not to speak. But if you open your mouth, what comes out is what you actually believe to be true. What happens next would not be what most people expect. The popular fantasy version of this scenario involves a world suddenly purified of corruption, of manipulation, of the social damage that dishonesty causes, politicians telling the truth, corporations disclosing their actual practices, relationships stripped of the pretenses that accumulate over years. This version is naive, and it underestimates how much of the current world depends on the existence of lying in ways that are not obviously harmful. Start with the most immediate effect. Within the first hour, an incalculable number of interpersonal relationships would receive information they were not designed to withstand. What do you actually think of my work? Do you find me attractive? Have you ever wished you were with someone else? Are you happy? The answers to these questions, delivered without the softening, the omission, the diplomatic reframing that human social interaction depends on, would be experienced by most people as forms of violence. Not because the truth is always brutal, but because the truth, delivered without the option of kindness through omission, and without the recipient's ability to soften the delivery through their own polite responses, would land differently than it does now. The family dinner table, where decades of carefully maintained silences and selective truths hold incompatible people in functional proximity, would not survive the first meal. And this points to something that most analyses of this scenario miss. Human social structures are not built on top of honesty with lying as a corruption of the underlying order. They are built significantly on strategic ambiguity, on willed ignorance, on the mutual agreement not to force certain questions into the open. The lie is not always the pathology. Sometimes it is the load-bearing structure. Consider what happens to diplomacy. International diplomacy depends structurally on the ability of representatives to maintain positions that do not fully reflect their private assessments, to express confidence they do not feel, to signal flexibility through indirection rather than direct statement. The diplomat who cannot lie cannot negotiate, or more precisely, can only negotiate in ways that expose every concession before it is made, every limit before it is tested, every internal disagreement before it is resolved. The result would not be more honest international relations. It would be the collapse of the formal mechanisms through which conflicts are currently managed without becoming violent. The same logic applies to commerce. Markets function partly on the basis of asymmetric information and the strategic management of that asymmetry. A seller who must immediately disclose every known defect, every relevant comparison product, every private assessment of fair value is not engaging in commerce as it currently exists. Price negotiations, which depend on each party maintaining positions they know they might abandon, would transform overnight into something that has never existed before, and it is not clear that it would function. Medicine would face an immediate and devastating crisis of a different kind. Placebo effects, which account for a measurable and significant portion of therapeutic outcomes across a wide range of conditions, depend on patients being told things that are not precisely true. This will help with your pain is often said when the evidence suggests it will help about 40% of the time. We have a good chance here is sometimes said when the speaker knows the odds are considerably worse. The therapeutic lie, the compassionate inaccuracy, is not peripheral to medical practice. It is woven into the management of hope, which is itself a clinical variable. The sudden elimination of this tool would require medicine to find new frameworks for maintaining patient hope without dishonesty. Frameworks that do not currently exist at scale. But the deeper disruption would occur at the level of identity itself. Humans are narrative creatures. The story you tell about yourself to others and in the private monologue of your own consciousness is not a neutral transcript of events. It is a constructed account that emphasizes, omits, reframes, and in many cases simply confabulates. Psychologists who study memory have demonstrated repeatedly that human memory is not a recording device. It is a reconstruction, and the reconstruction is shaped by the story we need the past to have been. If lying becomes impossible, what happens to the stories people tell about themselves? The person who has maintained for years, to their family, their colleagues, and themselves, that they chose their current life rather than settled for it, that the marriage was what they wanted, that the career was the plan, would suddenly be unable to sustain those narratives in conversation. The social performances that hold identity stable would become impossible to perform. This is where the scenario becomes genuinely strange, because much of what we call identity is, in the philosophical sense, a kind of fiction we maintain about ourselves. Not a lie in the simple sense of a deliberate false statement, but a constructed narrative that requires ongoing performance to remain intact. A world without lying is not just a world where people cannot deceive others. It may be a world where a certain kind of self-deception, the kind that requires external reinforcement through the performance of false narratives, becomes structurally impossible. What would remain? Something would. People who have built their sense of self on accurate self-assessment, on relationships that can withstand honesty, on work that they can describe truly, these people would not only survive the transition, they might find the world that emerged on the other side preferable in ways that are difficult to articulate from inside the current one. The political landscape would transform in ways impossible to fully predict, but the general direction is clear. Politicians who had built careers on maintaining positions they did not hold, on expressing convictions they did not have, would be immediately exposed, not through investigation or journalism, but through their own next public statement. The entire infrastructure of political spin, of carefully managed messaging, of strategic ambiguity on policy positions would collapse in one news cycle. What would replace it is genuinely unknown. The honest politician is not impossible. History contains examples, but the system that currently selects for and rewards certain kinds of dishonesty would have to be rebuilt from foundations that do not yet exist. Relationships that survived would be different from the ones that exist now, not necessarily better in every dimension. The brutal honesty of a world without lies would produce casualties, but the relationships that remained would rest on foundations that the current versions frequently lack. You would know if someone stayed, that they wanted to stay. You would know if someone said they loved you, that this was what they believed to be true in the moment they said it. There is a phrase that appears in many languages: tell me what I need to hear, not what is true, what I need. The existence of this phrase across cultures suggests that humans have always known the difference between truth and comfort and have frequently preferred comfort. A world without lying would be a world forced to find comfort somewhere other than in comfortable fictions. Whether that world would be better is not a simple question. Whether it would be honest is, by definition, the one thing you could know for certain.